Welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and your host. Each program we talk about issues that are important for elections. We hope to inspire you to talk about those same issues. And most important, when election time comes around, we want to help you be ready and willing to go vote. Our topic today is political communication and persuasion, and we have an expert to talk about that. She's a professor and has taught the subject. She's also Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and the Dean of Graduate Studies, former chair of the Department of Communication, all at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Our guest is Dr. Deborah Smith Howell. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad you're here, Deb. Tell us first, what got you interested in studying political communication and persuasion?
Yeah, that's a really, it made me think about that a little bit when I saw the question. I've always, I guess even as a child, I was interested in politics. I grew up, I was 5 years old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and I can remember that, the '68 election, and I'm not really sure, I wasn't in a political household, but those were very, very vivid memories. And then I was a college debater, and my first debate topic was resolved that the powers of the presidency should be significantly curtailed. So I had, and of course this was Watergate, right? And Nixon actually resigned soon after that. So the idea of kind of public life and oral communication, presentations, were things I've always been interested in. And so they just all kind of naturally evolved.
Okay. Well, let's get right into when persuading people, what kinds of methods are typically used to persuade people? What kind of types of messaging do we have?
And I guess when I want to think about that is think about kind of two ways of thinking about it. The types of appeals that are used, and those, just even in classical terms, those are our logical appeals, our emotional appeals, as well as those appeals to credibility and to ethics. So you have that in all kinds of different messages, or those are your standard appeals. Then the second part of it are the channels that are used. So whether we're face-to-face or visual or in print or the various types, and now it's really kind of exciting with all of the social media on the different ways that people are able to get information. So when you think about, when we think about how we're persuaded, you've got to think about what are the types of appeals in both those, and also those mechanisms that are being used for persuasion.
Okay. The other thing when you want to think about political persuasion or communication, it seemed to be important to know your audience. Yeah. So how does demographics affect the message?
That's actually really critical. One communication theorist, Kenneth Burke, said you can only persuade a man, and he was writing back in the 1920s, 30s, insofar as you can talk his language by gesture, tone, tonality, and goes on. So literally, the very foundation of persuasion is to understand that audience, because in order to get someone first even to listen to you, much less to change how they feel or believe or act, you've got to connect to something inside that individual. So trying to really understand that audience, and it can be, there are lots of different segments of the audience, and you want to think about all parts of it, but it really is the fundamental part of what you need to know to be able to persuade anyone. Okay. And can you tell a little bit about what is persuasive or not based on the audience? Yes, when we start, and then you can start segmenting it in so many different ways. But when you look at the demographics of your audience, you're going to want to think about things such obviously as age, gender, ethnicity, age, income, region of the country. All of those different types of things are going to affect to some extent how an audience is going to react to any particular message.
Okay. Yeah. So as our political parties and politicians, candidates are certainly paying attention to all these things when they're crafting their messages.
They are, and we're to a point now where I think, especially with the way that people are able to select sources of information, it's very nuanced in how some of those targeted messages are sent.
Okay. Let's talk about something else that affects communication, and that would be emotion. And probably the biggest one that people can think about is fear. People appeal to that a lot in communication. So how does emotion fit into this?
Yeah, emotional appeals are one of the primary types of appeals, and they're all different types of emotional appeals. But you're right, fear is is a major one, but it's also a really tricky one when you're talking about fear appeals, because, and there's been research on fear appeals going back to the very earliest, persuasion studies. And the thing about a fear appeal is if it's too intense, right, then people will avoid it. They just don't want to deal with it, that it's too much. And so you've got to think about that. The other part about a fear appeal is what is the source? So that if it's not from a credible source, so that the fear appeals interact with all kinds of different other variables when you're thinking about how persuasive a fear appeal is going to be. But it also is a motivator. I mean, you can just look at the type of discourse that you're hearing in any campaign. And much of the time, if you start looking at it carefully, the underlying message is related to a fear. Fear that Social Security won't be there. Fear that your job is going to be taken away. I mean, it gets, a lot of those things are fundamentally rooted in fear.
Okay. So do you think that takes it more down to a personal level for a person, that makes a difference if they can make it more personal?
There are other ways to make it personal, other than fear, but I mean, I do think that if you're going to, it goes back to that idea of you've got to know and know that audience and react to that audience. If you can connect that message to some type of desire, want, need of that audience, then you're going to have more impact.
Okay. The other thing that we've seen such a big change in through the years is I want to talk about how the change in media, particularly exclusively from print, has affected political communication. And do you think media has too much influence in political communication?
It's changed the nature of politics and public discourse and how we do campaigns. I mean, I don't think there's any way that you can think about that. I mean, it's, at one time, people went and listened to really long speeches, right? You would go and it would be nothing to listen to an hour or hours of a person talking about something. And then obviously there was print and you had billboards and the flyers types of things. But, just even, radio changed how we did politics. The first kind of television election, presidential election anyway, was in 1960. And if you look now at what we had in 1960 in terms of either the political advertisements or the debates that were done, they seem so primitive. They're long.
They weren't very glitzy, were they?
No, they weren't very glitzy. The other thing is, we had 5-minute, well, actually not just 5 minutes, but there were paid political advertisements that were 30 minutes and 5 minutes long. That was standard back in the early 1960s. And Ross Perot bought some time and did a 30-minute type of paid political ad. But other than that, we haven't seen that in decades with that. So as television changed, it changed how we do the various different campaigns. And now with the different kinds of news channel, or the different types of channels, with the 24 access, with now we're not just on television, with the Twitter and the Facebook and all of the different ways that people get their information, it makes it does fundamentally change the political campaigns.
Okay. And well, you've kind of gotten into how it's changed through the years, but let's talk about something that people always talk about. It seems like every political season, this one's no different, the number of negative ads. Are we really seeing an increase in the number of negative ads, and do they work? Has it always been this way?
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting too, because, and it kind of depends on how you define negative and how you count, what part of it that you're going to count when you're counting the different ads. If you look at the, some people would argue that if you look at the 1964 presidential campaign and some of the ads that were run then, actually the Daisy Girl ad only ran once during that. Is there anything more negative than the Daisy Girl ad? I don't know.
Tell our viewers a little bit, just refresh some memories for some of the younger viewers.
It's just revealing my age. But, but it was an ad that, and then the voiceover, it starts with a little girl picking, the flowers and counting down, and then the voiceover starts with Lyndon Johnson talking, and then about the future, and I should be able to quote it exactly, but I'm not sure that I can. But it ends with an explosion, a nuclear explosion.
Nuclear explosion.
So that if you choose Goldwater, there is going to be annihilation, we're all gone, right? And there was another one that was really fun where he chopped off California. That one's not as well known. The Daisy Girl.
The Daisy Girl is the one I remember. So
yeah, and the thing is it actually only ran once as a paid ad, but then it has been talked about and was talked about in so many ways, which is also another point, because even with your political advertisements, a lot of things that's really interesting about it is not just when it ran, but then how it's talked about afterwards.
Yes.
How it's picked up and talked about by television and radio, and now on Facebook and different types of things, so that it's that multiple use of it. So anyway, about the different things, about the negative ads, is yes, I mean, we're seeing there's more of that, but it is hard sometimes to say how much of it. I mean, now there's just more of everything. And then the idea is what makes something negative is truly a contrast, right? If I believe this and you believe that, or if you're stating what's basically fact, that you voted for this and I don't, are those negative? Sometimes maybe the way they're said, the way they're framed, maybe there are elements of it, but what does that mean? What is a contrast ad as opposed to one that is, that's targeted about the individual? Right? Or maybe you can, so it really is, a part of it is about definition, but are we trying, it goes back to your fear appeal part, right?
Yes, exactly.
Are we trying to what is it that we're trying to accomplish there, and how is it that we're kind of framing that particular event? That's not very clear. I apologize for that.
And the other part in talking about the negative ads, and you got into the part about contrast, is contrast couldn't be perceived as negative when you're really just drawing a distinction. And I think sometimes can it come close to being almost a personal attack? Is that when people tend to see it as being more negative?
And so, if it's really about an issue, right? I mean, most of the times if you look in the research and stuff, when it gets to be issue-oriented and it's contrast, you're not going to define it as a negative ad, right?
Right.
And so that's when you start looking through a lot of the literature, it won't talk about there being as much or as increasing or being maybe as dramatic as we think about kind of from our own viewing or our personal experience. And a lot of that is because it's like if you say anything contrary, oh, that's a negative ad. And now the thing that's interesting to me is listening to them is how people talk so much about the negative ads, right?
Yes,
exactly. So we're showing them over and over again, or trying to decide if that's a negative ad, and talking about how negative politics is. So it's all the other chatter that's talking about the negative as well. But true. Typically you would think about if you're really talking about the negative politics, you would be thinking about the personal attacks, that you're talking about somebody's character, somebody's, the way that they are, or in some ways, personalizing it and not just focusing on the issues.
Right. So now we're kind of in the territory of what has typically been called dirty politics or mudslinging.
Yeah.
And we did have a lot of that, didn't we, in the early years, 1800s? I mean, even worse than, would you say worse than now?
Yeah, there is Kathleen Hall Jamieson. The book has been out for a long time, but it's a book called Packaging the Presidency, which is a history of political advertising. And the first chapter is all about the 1800s. And perhaps nothing was ever quite so negative as when we didn't have some of the kinds of songs, the kind of rumors that were spread. It was vicious.
And they were about character and families.
Whether or not you had fathered an illegitimate child, all kinds of things. So I think there really is. I always try to be really careful about saying that it's the worst ever, it's the first time ever, it's the most ever, because most of the time when you think about those things and you start digging, it's like, well, maybe not exactly. It's just how we're feeling it and experiencing it. But I do think just the amount of information we have and the multiple types of sources of information and the whole idea of on demand. I mean, it's not even 24-hour news cycle. But we thought that was radical with CNN. Now it's on demand, and on your phone, you've got. How many different apps do you have on yours, right? That you can pull up, different types of political news.
And just in terms of the social media, how things get sent to hundreds, thousands
Right.
of people immediately.
Right,
on things
recycled over and over
They
again. Yeah,
do.
with the and picking it up on your Twitter, and that's what everyone's following. How many, what happened on the Facebook? How did it
Exactly.
chain out on Twitter? And so it's not just the event itself, whether it's an ad or a newscast or a debate. It's then how it chains out from there.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about something else in terms of political communication. I think this comes up during election season too, is that what's the difference between political communication and propaganda?
Yeah, and that's, I think that's a great question because, sometimes people will say, well, if I don't like it or I disagree with it, then that becomes propaganda. Propaganda is really more about disinformation, and we tend to think of it as that kind of intentional misleading. I mean, propaganda is a negative term, right? And that it is, when we think about propaganda, we're thinking about these deliberate attempts to mislead. And so even when you're thinking about some of these, when we look at a lot of the political messaging, I don't know that even if you disagree with it or you think that it's negative, that they're really deliberate attempts to mislead typically large populations too, as well. So,
well, I think when people hear propaganda too, they think back to World War II.
Absolutely.
They think about Nazi Germany and maybe Mussolini and Hitler.
And you start thinking about all of those, and those are deliberate campaigns, right, to get people to think about things that simply weren't true, couldn't be true, and trying to to mislead.
What about in our own 1950s, the kind of McCarthy era? Would you say that that had elements of propaganda?
And I don't know that I know enough about that. I mean, the idea of how those messages were communicated, so I'm not sure that I could say.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about something else that has affected political communication through the years, and that's the influence of money. So, what can you tell us about how that's changed through the years?
Well, I mean, and then there are lots of changes, and it keeps changing on us with some of the various laws with that. I mean, if you think about it, at one time, anyone could finance, if you had enough money, you could basically finance your own campaign.
Yes.
And one of the things that we enacted was, a lot of the campaign finance reform laws were designed to really create a broader field, right? So that you could get more people that were engaged in politics. So the whole idea of some of the early kind of campaign finance laws were to be able to increase access into the political arena. Same thing with the public financing, of the campaigns, right? So that you didn't necessarily have to be dependent, and you were trying to set the cap so that, there were more people and more voices would be there. But the advent of, the political action committees and now how they can spend independently, or people will choose to self-finance, right, and not go with those rules, it just, and it's kind of amazing with what can be done with that. I mean, and especially now with the super PACs, where you don't even have to reveal, kind of who your donors are, where those sources are, and they are, so-called independent from the candidates. But you can't read anything without saying "and Hillary super PAC" or that because they identify so strongly with a particular candidate, and while they're not controlled by the campaign, it just and that actually that idea of these other sources, and they always have very creative names, right?
Right.
So that they look very neutral and very but yet they have that particular agenda. So, and there's the amount of money that's spent.
Well, do you think money becomes the message at some point?
I don't know money, it does to a certain extent. I don't know if it's a message, but it just, the very idea of trying to broaden participation has in fact really narrowed the ability of voices to get through. I mean, if you don't have this, but if you don't have this amazing amount of support or money to be able to be on air, to be in the different, to have these messages out there, it doesn't seem like it's possible for you to be effective. But at the same time, you can have a phenomenal amount of money and not be effective. I mean, Jeb Bush is, the poster child of that for this election season. When you think about how well financed he was, and the kind of, campaigns that, political action campaigns that had lined up behind him, or committees that lined up behind him. But there's some classic examples. Connolly from Texas. I mean, there's, and I can't remember the exact number, but how few delegates he got when he ran for president, and how much they cost for each delegate.
So money definitely has an impact on our communication.
It has an impact, but it doesn't change everything. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Okay. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was that there have been some recent studies that have talked about that there are actual differences between what's persuasive to a liberal versus a conservative. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's not literature I'm as familiar with, but the part about that that's interesting is the idea that there maybe are personality characteristics or values that individuals have that will cause you to align more with one party or another, and those are very definitely the types of things that are going to influence how you react to particular messages. This is really recent, and I just heard it actually on NPR, but I thought it was fascinating, so I've got to go look it up. Okay. But the idea of, in this campaign, that we're talking about a demographic group that we say are evangelical voters, right?
Yes.
But what they really mean are, that's not about their relationship to Christianity necessarily. It's about other kinds of demographics when you do the research in terms of reaction to authority, to other types of groups. So those are those kind of personality variables, right?
Right.
And then what then are appealing to them. So we even have now some of the traditional evangelical churches. One of the ministers was saying, I don't want to be called an evangelical now, I want to be a gospel Christian, because that term has been politicized so and has been aligned with that. But it's not about the Christianity, it's about those other demographic variables.
Okay. So even the terms conservative liberal can mean something different to different people.
Oh, absolutely. And and those terms have shifted over time too, on what is conservative and what is liberal, or where you are with that.
Okay. The other thing I want to talk about with you is current research that's being done on political persuasion and communication. What kinds of things are being studied, and what are some of the most striking findings that we're finding out in the field?
Yeah, and that's I think the things that are exciting are really trying to understand all of the different types of social media. I mean, that's a huge type of work going on. How are the message being disseminated? And the different types of channels that people are using, and what they're going to find impactful. The other piece is it is that targeting that we talked about a little bit earlier. That kind of really, the use of, in the campaigns, the kind of what they call the big data, right? Feeding in all of those different types of variables, so that we're able to, campaigns are able to understand motivation at a very small level, whether it's in my zip code or even on my street, and then trying to understand how those work, I think, are some of the really interesting types of things that are going on. There also are actually, there are even, biopolitics studies. Are there things that we are, that are based on our biology that influence in terms of how we react politically.
So things that we wouldn't even know to think about.
Yep.
Okay. Well, as we're getting into this election season already, we've been really bombarded with a lot of different messages and information. And the one thing we wanted to talk about is how should viewers try to analyze everything that's coming at them that you're seeing? How do you sort out the fact versus the fiction?
Yeah, and it's really hard, because if you had to spend all of your time analyzing everything that you heard, read, saw, it would take everything. So everybody's going to use a certain type of shorthand, but you want to be careful about what that shorthand is, and so that you're able to think about it a little bit more, especially if when you're going to make a decision on that. But so part of it is just taking that time to be reflective. Am I reacting just because of who said it? Right? Sometimes, we've got a lot of people right now who are either endorsing or trying to use their own credibility to sway people in a particular way. So am I just reacting because of who said it? am I reacting primarily out of a particular emotion, right? And is that how I want to react? Sometimes people do want to react out of that emotion, but you want to recognize if it's there. The other thing is, and this is the great part, it's looking for more information, is that we've got some phenomenal, fact checks that go on, right? The League of Women Voters Guide is a great thing every election cycle, so that I'm able to look at, what are these actual positions, not with everything that kind of the extraneous, information. But on a regular basis, whether it's after a debate or anything else, there are organizations, neutral organizations, trying to verify truth and fiction in those political events.
Okay, and we have some of the other ones are like PolitiFact. You can go and look at, they'll fact check the candidates and
the papers run them regularly. You can get it online. So there's some great sources for that.
Okay. So also in analyzing, it's interesting that you said, you're looking at sources. It sounds like we tend to look to sources that we are comfortable with, that we use over and over. So how do you help identify your own biases and getting beyond that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's actually easier now to only look at information that you already agree with. I mean, because the markets are so segmented that you can create a profile that you can make sure that nobody ever disagrees with what you already believe. Now, that's not going to challenge you very much, you're not going to learn very much, but that's a lot easier to do that. And it's sometimes hard for us to recognize our own biases.
Yes.
And to think through that, because we think what we believe is fact, and the way that it is. So that's just part of that kind of self-reflection and willing to do some of that hard work to look at why you're reacting the way you are.
Yeah, it's always good to kind of question, could you be wrong once in a while to do that?
And the term debate, we never see it, one definition of debate is reason-giving discourse. So you should be looking for those reasons. But if you're going to engage in a debate, a real debate, you should be willing to change. And that's hard for us to do sometimes.
Okay. Well, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much again for being here, and I'm sure our viewers will find this useful as we wade through the rest of this election season and the messages.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here with us. So for the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, talk with others about them, and when election time comes around, go vote, Omaha.